Thank you again, everyone, for having us here and for coming out on such a beautiful day. Before I get started, I was wondering kind of where everyone is in the crowd. I mean, how many people here are lawyers or law students or aspiring lawyers? Wow. Okay, I'm not. So it's an honor to be here. I sometimes, I guess, play dress up as a lawyer with testify before Congress and speaking about these issues. But my background is as a reporter. I started covering these, the animal rights and environmental movements, and specifically how these activists are being targeted as terrorists in like 98 or 99. And I've been focusing on it ever since and doing other writing on the side as well. So I think my role then as the non-attorney is to start out very big and kind of give an overview of where we're at politically right now, kind of what's going on in terms of the political and cultural climate and why attorneys are so desperately needed right now for activists in fighting legislative and legal battles. And I think to do that, first I wanted to give an example that's very close to home that someone sent me last week. And there was a meeting that you guys might have heard about by the Society of Toxicology, Tox Expo, which sounds like a wild and exciting time with wonderful people, I'm sure. And that was in Seattle recently, March 16th to the 20th. And in preparation for Tox Expo professionals hired a consulting firm, an investigative and intelligence agency to find out the threat that was posed by animal rights and environmental extremists. And so, you know, with the recession slumping and everything right now, if you guys are having a hard time once you get out of law school, I think the threat assessment area is a good way to go, because judging by the quality of the report, which I'm going to talk about real quick, you could really improve and provide your expertise to the threat posed by animal rights activists. And as part of this threat assessment, you know, they list a lot of illegal actions that have happened over the last 10 years, which I'm sure all of you are aware. There are various components of the animal rights and environmental movements, just like every other social movement. Some people do lobbying and legislative advocacy, some people are protesting, some people do nonviolent civil disobedience, and then there are people that do things like go out in the middle of the night and rescue animals from fur farms or vandalize McDonald's and things like that. So they list all these activities. They profile some of the organizations that are based locally. For example, the Northwest Animal Rights Network. And they say that no direct action, attacks, or other illegal activities are conducted in the name of NARN. However, there's crossover potential with the terrorists. One thing, though, that I wanted to note about this, to kind of give an overview of where we're at politically, and I think this really speaks volumes about what I'm going to be talking about, is they do a section that's activists of interest in the Seattle area. And as part of that, they each have a paragraph. Most of them aren't in Seattle, which again, if you're looking for jobs, you can provide your expertise, because these people are actually, most of them, in California. But our own Jen Kaplan is noted as an activist of interest. And a couple of the things that they say: she is a member of the New Jersey Animal Rights Alliance. She's worked with radical groups like Food Not Bombs, which gives food to homeless people. And prior to moving to the West Coast, she also had strong ties to several of the Shack defendants, which is a case I'll talk about in a minute. And perhaps the most damaging thing about Jen Kaplan, after Tyler's nice introduction of how hard she's worked, is that she currently maintains a large network of associates dedicated to animal rights and environmental conservation. You all, I'm sure. So, this is the political climate we're operating in right now. And I bring this up because, one, I think it's funny and it's good to laugh every once in a while of how grasping these groups are to create a threat and to demonize their opposition. But also because I think it's a really good example of so many things that are going on. One, it's an example of how corporations are jumping on this war on terrorism bandwagon and exploiting this rhetoric, exploiting the terrorism language, exploiting this kind of extra legal police powers and investigative powers to demonize activists. It ties to the broader political climate of, for example, with the Patriot Act, with the illegal search and surveillance orders, with the controversy in Congress trying to give immunity to the telephone companies, some of them who allowed the FBI and CIA and federal agencies, NSA, to set up shop in their offices to spy on Americans' phone calls and listen in. It ties into the broader political climate of not just an administration, but a bipartisan effort in Congress and in state legislatures to consistently push the limits of constitutional powers, to view the Constitution as not something that should be adhered to or to aspire to, but something that is in the way and that needs to be manipulated, pushed around to get to a bigger political objective. So if we're going to talk about dealing with activists as attorneys, I think we have to put everything in that political climate. When I started this website, Green is the New Red, I took that analogy from just one article I wrote about a case called Stop Hunting and Animal Cruelty. And originally it was just kind of a cute joke, and people kind of got the analogy between the Red Scare, one of the most powerful and well-known eras of government repression in US history at least, and what's going on right now. The demonization of people as communists, whether or not they actually believed in communism, and the demonization of people as terrorists, even if they're doing things like hosting events at a law school. But the more you get into it, the more eerie those similarities become. And that's kind of what I wanted to focus the majority of my comments on right now. And the way that era worked was really through three tiers. There was legislative attacks on people's civil liberties, there were legal attacks, and then there's a third element that I would call extra-legal. PR campaigns and smearing people and holding up the terrorist list with the names on them and just demonizing relentlessly. And all that's going on right now as well. On the legal front, you heard a little bit about a few cases just now, like with Ringling Brothers and Kevil West, the horse slaughter operation. As part of that, activists have engaged in illegal activity against those industries as well. There's a roundup of environmental and animal rights activists called Operation Backfire by the US government that was touted as a victory in the war on terrorism. The government has consistently said that radical environmentalists and animal rights activists are the #1 domestic terrorism threat. Not number 2 or 27 or 49, but #1. And they also acknowledge that those movements, even at their most extreme of using arson or property destruction, have never harmed a human being. These activists were rounded up, touted as terrorists even before they had stepped foot in the courtroom. And part of the things they were doing were targeting these very industries that are now have widespread public opposition against them, like horse slaughtering, genetic engineering. They were hauled before the court, forced with the choice of either cooperating against each other, becoming government informants, or potentially facing the rest of their lives in jail as terrorists. Some of them, unfortunately, did agree to cooperate against the other defendants and had reduced sentences. And those who refused were hit with terrorism enhancement penalties. They had the full weight of the Department of Justice coming down on them. And it's eerily similar to what happened during the Red Scare as well. When you have a relentless push in the name of national security to go after one group of people, to push so hard, to devote so many resources into doing it, and then these people are faced ultimately with the choice of, do you take a cooperation deal? Do you plead your guilt? Do you try to plea bargain in some way to just minimize the damage that's being done? Some other illegal cases that are going on right now, with Ringling, there were activists that have protesting Ringling for a long time, and Ringling has been pretty down and dirty about trying to fight back against grassroots groups. And one of the things they've done is tried to exploit the racketeering, I might get the name wrong, RICO, the mob law, Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organizations law, is that right, for the lawyers? Which is similar to what anti-abortion groups tried to use to go after. I just inverted that. It was a case with NOW trying to protect abortion clinics from protests by anti-abortion. I just inverted that again. You get my point here. I think I need some more coffee and donuts from the back. And I notice you guys are strategically placed back there. So they try to use RICO to go after these activists, even though that law was clearly never intended to go after protesters. And the courts have said as much, but they're just grasping at straws. They're trying to expand the scope of their power, manipulate the law, manipulate the Constitution, manipulate existing statutes to get to their political objective. You also have cases, again with Ringley, some activists were protesting out in Virginia not too long ago. Like many protests these days, some of these activists were wearing masks. It's not because they're doing anything illegal. They were holding signs. They weren't moving. Some of them had bullhorns, but they weren't yelling in people's faces. They were wearing masks because of this political climate of people being labeled as terrorists, of this #1 domestic terrorism threat. The activists I talked to said, well, you can't just sit home because then that's giving in to everything that's going on right now. But at the same time, with some situations like this, you don't feel too comfortable being at the protest when people are taking photos of you and the FBI agents are harassing you. So what do? Some of them decided to wear masks. Well, the Joint Terrorism Task Force was apparently harassing these activists for quite a while and ultimately arrested one of them on felony charges using a Virginia anti-mask law that was originally passed to target the Klan. That activist is now facing felony charges for wearing a mask at a protest, not doing anything else besides wearing a mask. So you see this conflation of a couple of things. There's a conflation between corporations and the government, Joint Terrorism Task Force working with Ringley. There's also a conflation between illegal and legal activity. All those lines are being blurred. So a couple of the major legal attacks going on right now, there's a case called Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty, which I've referenced before. In that case, those activists were not charged with doing anything like I mentioned at the start of this portion of the talk, like breaking windows. They were never charged with arson. They were never charged with stealing animals from laboratories. They were never charged with gluing locks or throwing paint on people that wear fur. They were charged with conspiring to violate a law called the Animal Enterprise Protection Act. And they conspired to violate that law, according to the government, by running a website that every time there was either a legal or an illegal action in the name of this campaign to shut down this controversial lab, they posted it. A lot of it was very almost all of it was very tongue-in-cheek, kind of like the Nelson from The Simpsons, if you guys watch The Simpsons. Kind of this pointing and laughing, like, ha-ha. So if there's something illegal, it's just really snotty, pretty juvenile at times, pointing and laughing, reveling in watching this company being knocked off the New York Stock Exchange, being pushed down to the pink sheets, which is almost the bottom of the barrel for corporations. And the government said that by publishing rhetoric like that, by being very snotty and tongue-in-cheek, and also by doing things like publicizing protests and also publicizing addresses of corporations and addresses of executives who work for those corporations, which were used by activists for legal home protests, and the government argued also used by activists for illegal activity, that this was all part of a conspiracy to commit animal enterprise terrorism. So what we're having is the return of this conspiracy charge, which has popped up with many social movements throughout US history. When you can't get the people that are actually doing the crime, you go after the people that vocally support that ideology and vocally support those tactics. Some of the other legal cases going on right now are dealing with FBI informants, harassment, surveillance, and infiltration, which is also something social movements throughout history have dealt with, such as the American Indian Movement. You have programs like COINTELPRO going against Martin Luther King and Students for a Democratic Society and the anti-war movement. And basically anyone who a lot of people I'd imagine in this room would hold up in respect as being on the right side of history and fighting for the right issues at the right time were demonized and surveilled and harassed. And now it's getting to an extreme. I just posted something on the website yesterday about some activists I talked to in Minneapolis who, one of them was approached by the FBI and asked to become an informant and was offered to be paid a significant amount of money in part to attempt to infiltrate and go to vegan potlucks. Which, again, in this economy, best job ever. I mean, you just have to kind of get used to it. It might be hard to stomach the fact that you're violating people's privacy and their trust, and you're incriminating people and spying on them, violating their constitutional rights, and having a chilling effect on their ability to, just sit around and eat cupcakes and talk about political issues. But if that's not a problem, getting paid to go to vegan potlucks is a pretty sweet deal.
The reason they said justified this is in gearing up for the RNC that's happening this summer, as if vegans or animal rights people are the biggest threat to protests of the Republican National Convention, which is even more ridiculous.
Well, and clearly, there's no greater threat to the United States right now than vegan potlucks. And I laugh, but I have to laugh, and I've been getting more and more kind of snotty on the website because you have to laugh because it's getting to such absurd heights. There was a children's movie that came out called Hoot that was based on a really popular kids book, and industry groups heard about it and they labeled it softcore eco-terrorism for kids. The remake of Charlotte's Web came out and it was labeled by the Center for Consumer Freedom as animal rights extremism. You have the National Rifle Association put out publication labeling animal rights terrorists as one of the greatest domestic terrorism threats to the Second Amendment. You kind of think that the terrorists like guns, but apparently not. Apparently they're a threat to not only national security, but the Second Amendment as well. And it just goes on and on. The absurdity and the lengths to which these groups are willing to go to push their political agenda, there's really no limit to it at this point. All that legal activity, though, is going on at the same time as these groups are trying to push the envelope even more. One of the things I've focused a lot of my efforts on is called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And a lot of times when I'm doing these speaking events, it's even just focused on that law because I think it is so dangerous. It has such dangerous implications for everyone that cares about any issue, regardless of what that issue is. But it expands the definition of animal enterprise terrorism. So even though we have these activists that are rounded up as terrorists for doing nothing more than vandalizing SUVs or pulling up genetically modified crops, and even though you have groups like these shack activists who've done nothing more than run a controversial website that I would concede perhaps pushes the limits of constitutionally protected speech, but does not cross that line. Even though all of those people are already being labeled as terrorists, even though the government's already getting the green light to infiltrate vegan potlucks and to just smear people left and right and have surveillance powers and everything out, expand the Patriot Act, or pushing for an expansion of the Patriot Act. Even in light of all that, when I testified, you have the government saying our hands are tied in going after these extremists. Our hands are tied, we need more power. We need more legislation. We need more surveillance powers. We need more power to label people as terrorists. The laws aren't nearly broad or vague enough. And they got it. The law was passed unanimously in the Senate and passed by a procedure called suspension of the rules in the House, which if you're not kind of a DC legislative nerd like I am, it's a procedure meant to pass non-controversial legislation. That same procedure was used that same week to honor the St. Louis Cardinals for winning the World Series. And it was used to honor the man who created the Roth IRA by renaming a bridge in Delaware after him. So, IRA, baseball, and terrorism, it's like the holy trinity of American culture. So this is what we're dealing with. The people rushing through this legislation, 6 members of Congress were in the room. Everybody else was absent, in part because they were breaking ground for a new memorial honoring that terrorist, Martin Luther King, on the National Mall. Meanwhile, the same tactics, such as nonviolent civil disobedience, that King promoted and used and was demonized for, are being labeled terrorism through legislation, but only if they're done by people that believe in animal rights. There's also other pending legislation right now, kind of mirroring that on the state level. There have been a few terrorism laws, like in Pennsylvania. It's come up quite a few times in Washington, Oregon, also in Texas, my home state. And now there's a new law pending in California. And I wanted to tie this to the last presentation as well, putting it in not just the political climate of the war on terrorism, but the political climate of the headway that national organizations are making, that according to industry publications, like the meat industry publications, the egg publications, the dairy publications, which are wild and exciting reading, I highly recommend it, but they're very open about the fact that these groups are viewed as a threat to their entire industry